Welcome back to UK Bike Fit, and today we're going to discuss why Tadej Pogačar and more recently Jonas Vingegaard have taken the advice of bike fitters worldwide after years of calling for shorter and shorter cranks. Tadej Pogačar is now riding 165s and Jonas Vingegaard is riding 150mm cranks. He's been recently spotted in the wild at Volta Algarve on 150mm SRAM cranks that seem to have been custom made for him. We're going to have a look at the reasons why he might have done that and some of the benefits he might be getting out of doing that, and a bit of a discussion around crank length as a topic. So we're going to discuss why bike fitters have been calling for shorter cranks for such a long time and some of the benefits around that, and not just for professional cyclists but for regular cyclists like you and me, and whether we're going to see more high-level professional cyclists move to a shorter crank now that Pogačar and Vingegaard and Wout van Aert have all seemingly made that jump. So the first reason that we're going to look into is, or potential reason we're going to look into, is aerodynamics. So obviously aerodynamics for a professional cyclist is much more important than most amateur and recreational cyclists, and you've got to think that aerodynamics is going to be a big consideration into any change they make to their bikes or to their equipment or to their kit or their helmet or anything like that. Aerodynamics is going to always be measured and tested amongst the higher level professional cyclists, especially Jonas Vingegaard, who's obviously going for the Tour de France this year. There's going to be no stone left unturned into performance gains such as aero. I've seen a few things online that have mentioned aerodynamics in the form of the cranks themselves and them being shorter, so that creates some sort of smaller frontal area, and I can sort of see that being true, but I don't think there's a massive gain from a smaller frontal area, especially down there at the feet where there's a lot of turbulent air anyway. I don't think that the actual aerodynamics of the crank is going to make a massive difference. But where you can get aerodynamic benefit from a shorter crank is actually through the rider's body position. And having a shorter crank, which will open up the hip angle at the top of the pedal stroke for the rider, gives them a little bit more space to actually flex and bend into. So it will either allow the rider to get into a more aerodynamic position comfortably, or it'll enable them to sustain the same aerodynamic position for a longer period of time. And that, in terms of aerodynamics, the rider's body is by far the biggest influencer in your overall drag. So if they can get an increase in position or a decrease in position, whichever way you want to look at it, and a better aerodynamic position, then the shorter crank is going to enable the rider to flex further, get into a lower position and hold it for longer. So the second point I want to talk about with the shorter crank is this trend amongst some professional cyclists' bike fits in having this more forward knee position. So by that I mean through the front of the pedal stroke, having their knee further forward than their foot through that down phase of the pedal stroke. And we've seen that a lot, especially with Pogačar. Pogačar last year had a really forward position, and a lot of other riders, we've seen the same sort of thing. Now, having a shorter crank, which effectively, if this is your knee and this is your foot, if the bottom bracket is here, having a shorter crank brings the foot back in relation to the knee without you having to move your body weight further forward on the bike to get over the pedal stroke. Now, that may or may not be a consideration for Vingegaard, but it will create that more forward knee position without having to change the weight distribution versus the bike as a whole. So instead of him having to shuffle forward with his hip position, by bringing the foot back, he can get that forward knee position without having to distribute the weight differently through the bike. So the third thing, and probably most important advantage of shorter cranks versus all of the aero and potential performance gains, is the biomechanics of the pedal stroke, and how having a shorter crank can make the biomechanics of the pedal stroke more comfortable, more efficient, and especially when you're in aggressive riding positions like all of these pro cyclists are going to be in. So The crank length has the biggest effect, or the biggest change on the biomechanics, through the top of the pedal stroke. And the two main areas or main joints that it affects is the hips and the knees. So at the hips, it allows you to maintain a more open hip position without having to get into a very tucked, flexed position through the top of the pedal stroke. And in the knees, it prevents the knees from being so flexed through the top of the pedal strokes and keeps them a little bit more open. And those two things together are going to do two main things. One, there's going to be less pressure on the joints and potential for injury, and it'll probably reduce his risk of injury. And two, it keeps his muscles working in the middle of their range for longer through the pedal stroke. So if you imagine at the top of the pedal stroke, you're in a very flexed position, your glutes are on quite a stretched position there. Whereas if the knee is a bit lower, the glutes won't be as stretched when they're starting their pedal stroke through the down phase, and he's going to be a bit more powerful because the muscle is more powerful in the middle of its range. So instead of working in those outer ranges, the muscles can work in the mid ranges more of the time through the pedal stroke, and that's only going to be an advantage for him. So moving away from the specific improvements that Vingegaard and other pro cyclists might be able to get out of a shorter crank, I think the really big positive out of this light that's been put onto crank length is that more people are thinking about their own crank length and whether they might be on cranks that are too long for them, and what going to a shorter crank length might be able to help them with. And from a bike fit point of view, that is the biggest win out of this situation, I think, because we see a hell of a lot of riders who come in here, and because the industry has put historically long cranks on bikes, especially for the relative frame size. We see a lot of riders that could do with a shorter crank, and trying to explain that and sort of break down that mental barrier about, oh, I've got to change my crank length, and whether you should think about changing your crank length or not. It's really useful that crank length is in the spotlight and in the cycling news, and I think it will help a lot of people sort of preempt a change to their crank length, because bikes are still coming out of the factories with long cranks relative to the frame sizes. It's no big secret that there is not a lot of choice out there in crank length, especially when you buy a bike, but also aftermarket. There's still not that great a range in crank lengths. There are some brands that are doing shorter cranks now, and even adjustable cranks, which can help a lot of people. If they're deciding between a few crank lengths, they can put a crank set on that gives them the choice and allows them to test different crank lengths for themselves without having to buy multiple chain sets or crank sets. So that's really useful. But I think this crank length issue has just been further highlighted. Again, it's something that bike fitters have been talking about for a long time, but until the pro cyclists do it, the mainstream cyclists and regular cyclists don't really think about it too much. But now the pros are starting to do it, I think we'll see a lot more people who start thinking about their own crank length. So in summary, the likes of Pogacar and Vingegaard and Wout van Aert and these other pro cyclists that we've seen move to a shorter crank maybe getting a biomechanical advantage and an aerodynamic advantage from being able to get into a more aero position and hold it sustainably for longer. But the biggest win and the biggest positive out of this situation is that more recreational cyclists and amateur cyclists are going to think about their own crank length. The demand for shorter cranks is probably going to increase, and this will put a bit more pressure on those companies that create cranks to offer shorter variants in their range. Let me know in the comments down below what cranks you're riding and whether you've tried any shorter cranks and what the advantages or disadvantages to shorter cranks that you've found are, because this is all a very individual topic. And if you want to see any more bike fit content, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we'll be churning out some more videos like this in the near future.